Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here with us today for session 3 in the data leadership using CAASPP Data for System Improvement training series. I'm going to give people about a minute or so to log in, get settled, and then we will be off and running. All right, well, we have a packed afternoon for us today, so I'm going to go ahead and get moving. Thank you, everyone, for being here on behalf of the California Department of Education and ETS. My name is Chelsea Talaku, and I am a research associate at WestEd. And you are here at session 3, Leadership and Culture for Effective Data Use. And that's part of the Data Leadership using CAASPP Data for System Improvement training series. So first, before we begin, just a little housekeeping. Please make sure your microphone is muted unless otherwise directed. To do that, you can select the arrow next to the microphone icon, either to start or change your audio connection. We will be utilizing the chat feature at certain points as directed throughout this training today. And when instructed, please select the chat icon. This will provide a chat window on the right-hand side of your screen that you can use to type any responses. We are also going to be utilizing Padlet today for some engagement and also to share resources for you. The link to the Padlet has been dropped in the chat box. And let's take a moment and we can travel over to the Padlet and I can go over some of the features and functionality. So this is the Padlet that we're going to be utilizing today. There's a lot of information on here, starting over on the far left-hand side with the meeting information. There is a link there to materials for today's session, information about attendance verification, and you can also grab a link to the evaluation form at the conclusion of our time together today. If you have questions that need technical support, questions about the webinar today, you can post them in that next column. In order to post anything to any of the columns, please select the plus sign at the top of that column. It will open up a window where you can type in the subject and body of your query. And then you can go ahead and hit that pink publish button. And then your question will pop up right on the Padlet. And then we can either answer the question directly or provide further assistance. There are going to be times throughout our presentation here today where you may be asked to reflect about something that we go over in the presentation on the Padlet. So that is to serve as sort of a virtual gallery walk. So we can share our thoughts more easily with our colleagues here today. The nice thing about this Padlet is it will be available for you at the conclusion of our time together today. So if there are resources that we have linked or any other information, you can always refer back. But please note that though the Padlet and the information will be available to you, the Padlet itself is not going to be monitored after our time together today. So if you have additional questions, please make sure to direct them to the appropriate parties. That might be your success agent, that might be somebody else at your site, or you can always contact caltrainings@wested.org as well. So we are so thankful to have with us today our fantastic training team. We have Evan Bartelheim, who is in charge of accountability and data literacy, at the Los Angeles County Office of Education, and also Dr. Tacey Rogers, who is the Director of Assessment, Research, and Evaluation at Solano County Office of Education. So great to have you both here with us today. Thank you. This particular training series is made up of 4 sessions. Session 1 is about the role of summative data in a data use culture. Session 2 is about putting data in context to make decisions. Session 3, which you're here for today, is all about leadership and culture for effective data use. And session 4, coming up this Thursday, is a shared practice panel. where practitioners are going to provide information around systems that they have put in place at their sites that have positively impacted their data culture at their particular sites or districts. If you're interested in attending that session, a link to sign up has been placed in the chat for you. So our agenda for today, we're here right now with some welcome and housekeeping. Then we're going to talk about what a culture of data use looks like. We'll then discuss centering equity to ensure effective assessment and data use. We'll go into leadership for effective assessment and data use, and then leading a balanced assessment system with a quick wrap up at the end. So just like teachers and students in a classroom, we want to be really clear about what our goals are for learning. In this session, participants will understand the importance of the role of leaders in supporting effective assessment and data use, and what leaders can do to cultivate and encourage a culture of effective data use. And our success criteria for today is that participants can identify key practices that they can employ in their own context to lead a culture of effective data use. We're going to be asking you to do a bit of thinking, a bit of reflection, so that you can have something concrete to take away with you to your practice. So quickly, let's open the chat up for our first chat today and think about, what do you think you would observe within a culture of effective data use? When we talk about a culture of effective data use, what does that conjure up for you? What does that bring to your mind? Take a few moments and enter that into the chat. What does a culture of effective data use look like? Shared presentations and data. So some transparency is what I'm seeing there. Collaboration built on trust. I see the word transparent again. Professional learning community decisions. So again, building consensus together, ongoing meetings around data governance, discussions around specific data measures that are important to the organization. So centering those conversations around shared values, collaboration, trust, all of these things are critical to have some of these discussions because they can be tricky at times. I see bringing teachers into the discussions as well. That's fantastic. Collaboration, again, conversations, questioning, building shared knowledge as well, unbiased data. That's what we want to get to the best of our ability as well. Making sure it's turned into useful information. The context is everything, isn't it? So we're going to talk about that as well. Strategic interventions. What can you then do with that data as well? What are the implications about having these discussions? Really great. Thank you so much for entering this information. We're going to touch on a lot of these topics throughout our time together today. And now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our wonderful facilitators. Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea. So I'm going to cover the culture of data use. And you may have noticed when Chelsea introduced me, my title is Project Director of Accountability and Data Literacy. And honestly, if I had been in the room when they were writing the job description, I would have probably said accountability and data culture, because I feel like data literacy is kind of just a subcomponent of the broader idea of data culture. But this gets right into my wheelhouse. I love it, and I just feel like everybody's primed for the conversation we're going to have today based on what we saw in the chat. So we'll start off with a definition for you, and so we can ground each other. So let me just read this quote. A strong data culture results when an organization believes in continuous improvement and regularly puts that belief into practice. Schools and districts that have strong data cultures emphasize collaboration as a keystone for success, and they empower teachers and administrators to make decisions for which they will be held accountable. So based on what you put in the chat or what you're thinking, how does your vision for a culture of data use match up with the definition given here? I hope it's close, right? So in other words, based on this definition, a culture of data use means that an LEA, a school or a district, has an organizational system and structures that are in place to ensure that this data work is ongoing, it supports continuous improvement, and it happens without oversight. Or as I used to like to say, you don't have one person who, when they retire, the whole system falls apart. If you have a good culture of data use, it continues on. No one person is instrumental. It's just embedded in the system. So in order to get there, you have to really nurture the culture of data use. It doesn't happen organically. You really do have to establish that. And so in an organization where you find an established culture of data use, the use of data really happens across the organization in practical ways, just as part of your everyday business. So this is really supported by the intentional creation of the structures and practices around data use, and also embedding data literacy skills within and across systems. I know I saw several references to structures and systems in there, which is great. So that suggests to me that that's already ongoing in many of your LEAs. So data use practices really are seen as just one of the tools that are implemented to complete the daily work of teaching and learning. There's also a distinction drawn between compliance-driven data use and inquiry-based data use. And this distinction is really important to create that safe environment. I saw the word trust pop up a lot. So you really do have to make this distinction to create the safe environment that's necessary for the effective use of data. So teams will also help to build understanding and meaning around the data. So I saw a lot of that too. It's not necessarily data that's analyzed by one individual in a vacuum. You know, I think a lot of times principals sitting there working on the CIPSA, right, pulling the data together. No, actually, it's placed on the professional judgments across multiple levels, right? From the, you know, and if you're here in this room, by the way, you're definitely considered a data leader in my mind. You're making, whether you're a classroom teacher or you're an assistant superintendent, you know, even have classified people, I think, who take a data leadership role. So in a data culture, you have everyone involved in that process. And there's an acknowledgement that all those folks bring knowledge to the conversation. So in addition, there's this culture of continuous improvement. We talk a lot about this at the LACO and other county offices. It's around building the staff's own knowledge of data literacy and data use to inform practice and policy. And it's an ongoing process. There's always something more to learn. So there are 5 elements in a culture of data use. It's important to attend to all 5 of these elements simultaneously so you can avoid imbalances across the system. So first is ensuring access to data. And if you are the data gatekeeper, you'll know what I'm talking about. That used to be me. I was the person who everybody came to, can you run this report? Can you run this report? How do you access this? And not only is it exhausting, it's incredibly inefficient, and it really does not lend to a good data use culture. So this means, you know, when it's effective, the data is accessed, coordinated, filtered, it's prepared in ways that allow educators to quickly and efficiently analyze, interpret the data, to answer key questions and address important teaching and learning issues. Secondly, there is making meaning from data. So this element really reflects that protected time is provided to allow users of data to collectively make sense of what the data indicates and to explore how to move from data to evidence that will inform instruction. You have to create the time. That's really critical. It can't just be, we have a culture of data use, but then you don't signal by giving time to look at data in a meaningful way. Third, there is the clarifying expectations of data use. There are clear expectations about how to use the data, and these expectations change over time. So as your skills, as your staff skills increase and they become more knowledgeable, you have to adjust your understanding of what these expectations are. Fourth, there's the building of knowledge and skills to use the data. So this really is kind of that data literacy piece. This reflects that there's professional learning around data use. You can't just expect people to pick this up intuitively from being around the data. You have to be very explicit and intentional. You have to provide assessment literacy, and you have to help folks understand the use of data to inform instruction in a way that's differentiated and is available for everyone on the staff. So it's really integrated into daily practices and supports teachers in building their own content knowledge. Then finally, the final element is this leading the culture of data use. And as I said, if you're here, you're a data leader. Whatever your role is, you are a data leader, and you'll walk out of here, I think, with some new tools to basically inform that leadership role. So as a leader, your role is to support and encourage a culture of data use and to develop those structures that include the time and the resources that are needed to conduct those ongoing data dialogues, to get the feedback that support the users to act on the knowledge that's acquired through that looking at data. Leaders' knowledge and use of data is really central to helping educators interact around issues that will lead to the improved learning outcomes. It's really incumbent on the leaders to make that happen. So I want to take a minute to reflect. Now you've seen the 5 elements of in the culture of data use, and consider within your system, within your LEA, which are areas of strength and which need work. And we've dropped a link to a Mentimeter. It's a polling tool. We've dropped that into the chat box. And you're going to click on that link to navigate to Mentimeter and order the 5 elements from strongest to weakest in your context. So we'll let you start filling that in. I'm curious, Tacey, what do you think your experience was in the last LEA work, not the county office, but rather where you last worked? What did it look like?
Oh, wow. It's a big question, Evan. And I would say a strength was access to data. That was very high at the last organization that I worked for. And I would say the area where we had the most work as an organization probably would have been making meaning, because and you talked about the direction, right? Like without the clarity, then the meaning is kind of left for interpretation. And that leaves it open to being weaponized, to being misinterpreted. And so access, no problem. That was a top on the list. But the meaning piece, there were opportunities and reflection, like in hindsight, right? It's so clear to me now. I can say making meaning probably would have been in the greatest area of strength. What about you?
Well, I kind of agree, although I did think at the time the access was an issue. And there's just so much, right? We call it the drip, right? The data rich, information poor. We collected data and we did present a lot of data publicly, but it sometimes could be overwhelming. And there are pieces of data, like I always wanted more people to look at our California Healthy Kids survey. I wanted, to do a deep dive around that. And it was just the ability to access that data and share widely. It was really challenging because people just felt overwhelmed, and it needed to be more targeted. If I go back now, I maybe do it a little more strategically, but yeah, and it's interesting seeing how it plays out here. Ensuring access to data seems to be a top, from the very first responses, seems to be the highest priority. Leading the culture of data use, I would say that was, to me, my latest learning, and since taking this role, has been that culture of data use and what that looks like. And it's really opened my eyes, because it really is, like, part of it is how to put some context around the data, how to share that data with your educational partners, your community. There's so many. It's a fraught position when you're talking about data. Sometimes, sometimes you're just the messenger, and you really feel like, I'm just here to tell you what the test results say. I'm not here. I didn't really do everything that's happening here, but oftentimes you're treated as though you are responsible. So. But yeah, I think this the way these kind of break down, and I do see building knowledge and skills to use data. I think that one's become more prominent, particularly around our Smarter Balanced. There's a lot to share there, and I think we've had it around long enough that people are. What was really telling to me was when people were asking about claim and target data, like when that was no longer appearing, and people were really upset about that when they first started using the abbreviated test forms. And you're like, that's actually the silver lining. We know that people are invested in those results. So they're really looking at it. Well, thank you for sharing, for joining us. And I think I'm now handing it off to you, aren't I? Yeah.
Thank you, Evan. I could look at those results for minutes and minutes, and I feel like it's a whole analysis just on all of the colleagues that are in the room now, with looking at how everyone responded to that poll. It's so fascinating. And I also think about how you pose the question, Evan, like as we change organizations and move to other places, and how that contributes to our learning as professionals, and kind of we learn from these different experiences that follow us from each organization, or that we bring. In this section, we'll talk about how we as leaders, and Evan mentioned this, all of us in this room, we are the data leaders, right, for our organizations, how leaders can really center equity in practice and policy. And in doing so, we can infuse the local story into our data gathering. And that focus on the local story contributes to the ways that we center equity. And it helps us think about how we tell that story and what patterns we're seeing, and how our assessment data is incorporated into the bigger picture of the story, the organization's story, the school's story, and the focus on identifying that context, how that might present itself as we report on our outcomes and really analyze them. So let's talk about this together. Here is a quote that you see on the slide. It comes from the Equity and Excellence Commission, and I will read it here. It says, "Any goal of competitiveness and excellence must start with equity or be doomed to fail." And so the Equity and Excellence Commission, I want you to think about this quote because we're going to ask you to respond to it in the chat. The Equity and Excellence Commission is an advisory, a federal advisory committee whose role is to provide the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education on any disparities that exist across the country in prohibiting meaningful educational opportunity, any disparities that give rise to the opportunity gap. And so think about this quote and what comes up for you as you hear it. I'll read it once more. Any goal of competitiveness and excellence must start with equity or be doomed to fail. What comes up for you when you hear and read that quote? Can you share your thoughts in the chat? The chat has been opened for you to share. Any goal of competitiveness and excellence must start with equity or be doomed to fail. What comes up for you when you hear or read that? If it's not open to all, it's really not a competition. That's a really good reflection. That's a really strong point. Any others? We'll wait a few more seconds here. Is there anything else that comes up for you as you hear or read this quote? What about you, Evan? Did this quote spark any thoughts or wonderings for you?
You know, we've talked about this before, Casey, but you know, my district, this is about 7 years ago now, but we actually did an equity study. And I had, as the director of assessment, research, and evaluation, I was like, okay, they're going to uncover, and we did a lot of data diving. So I supported a team led by Dr. Pedro Noguera, and I was expecting the outcome to be real structural inequities, but a lot of what came out of it came out of our student focus groups and that voice that came out of there. And it was really about just the engagement with those students and their feeling like they had, that they were being given the opportunity to learn and they were being taken seriously. And so, yeah, whenever I think, because we talked a lot about, the equity gap within our district and how to close that. And it was really a district with a great deal of extremes, small, relatively affluent district, but had a lot of students still there who were struggling economically. And you're like, how do we make this work? But it came down to, engaging students in the educational process and hearing their voice.
Mm-hmm. And we see that coming through in the chat. If we do not consider equity in our data leadership, then we will not create impact for all, which is exactly the picture that you're describing, Evan, around the purpose of that audit. The work is irrelevant if it isn't equity. Another reflection here that we see, competitiveness is good to push to creativity, but the equity starts with little to no barriers of entry. That's very powerful. The lack of inequity makes it irresponsible to compare some data unless we are looking to improve or support our support systems. Thank you for that. This is, I really value these reflections, and this commission, the Equity and Excellence Commission that you see referenced on the slide, was charged with focusing on school finances and improving school funding equity. And so as I was reading and preparing for today, I wondered if, for those of you who offered reflections in the chat, if knowing that the commission was charged with identifying potential gaps or inequities across school finance systems, if that changes your reflection. For me, it didn't change mine, because even when I think of those reflections that are listed in the chat, it still applies, right? The focus of the commission being school finances. However, it's almost like a content area. With equitable practices, you can apply it to math, you can apply it to science, you can apply it to assessment data review, you can apply it to school finance review, as this commission did. And it still holds true, these concepts that you all are calling out in the chat. Lots of.
Just to add on that, one of the latest quotes was, systems of evaluating data should consider equity to ensure that stakeholders are not left out of the equation. You know, you tend to think of like, oh, did we disaggregate our data? Do we look at, you know, all, but it's easy sometimes to overlook, is everybody represented at the table to have an opinion on the data too? Like, it goes both, the process and the data itself has to be equitable.
Indeed. Thank you for highlighting that. The process itself as well. I appreciate that. This quote and the direct link to the report is listed in your reference guide that you likely received in your materials for today. It's also on the Padlet, where the link has been placed in the chat. And there's a direct quote to that report for your reference. Let's keep going here and take a look at another quote. I'll start off by reading it. It says, "Equity is the attainment of comparably positive outcomes for all groups within or served by any complex system through implementation of policies, practices, and procedures that remove systemic barriers and provide the supports needed to ensure everyone's full and successful participation in the system. Equity exists when race, ethnicity, language, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, national origin, physical or cognitive ability, socioeconomic status, and other such characteristics are not predictors of outcomes for any group or the individuals in it." This reference is also in section 2 of your reference guide. If you're like me, I had to print it out for content like this. It's heavy and reflective. I like to have hard copies. And this quote comes from a document that it includes a glossary for shared understanding. And when I saw this resource, I was particularly excited. So it's in section 2 for slide 17. Those of you who are following along on the Padlet or with your handouts, I was particularly excited because as we are, and as Evan said, evaluating our process for data review and thinking about the culture in which our organizations are embedding data access and data review and data literacy, it's important that we have these shared definitions. And as the quote mentions, our systems are so complex, and any barriers that exist are most often systematic. And so if equity is to be a lens applied to any content, right? Like any context, whether you're looking at instructional content, or as we mentioned in the prior quote, school finances, or as Evan mentioned, our data review process. We're applying equity as a lens. Like the image in my head is literally glasses, and glasses that we're choosing to wear. So we're choosing to put these glasses on as we engage in the work. We're saying that we as professionals, we wear these glasses, these equity glasses, this equity lens, our organization wears them, and we have to all be looking through the same pair. The same way your glasses have a prescription and it's calibrated so that both eyes match or both eyes are customized. We have to have the same lens. So we put on the glasses and identify what data it is that we see. And if we take the glasses off, do we see the same thing? Like it's this intentional act of looking through this lens of equity. The resource in the reference guide, this equity framework where this quote comes from, supports you in ensuring that everyone in your system who's going to engage in this culture of data use, engage in this assessment data review, that their lenses, their equity lenses are calibrated, like a prescription, if you will. This document is a list of resources, and it was created by the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and it is great. It's not too long, but for each word, each reference, it has resources for you to begin to start contributing to your organizations, your departments, the sphere of influence that you have in this data work, ensuring that the definitions are uniform across the areas that you influence as you're engaging in the review of assessment data. Let's keep going. One more quote. Is that okay? It's not too much for you, is it? This quote says, "Equity is the effort to provide different levels of support based on an individual's or group's needs in order to achieve fairness in outcomes. Working to achieve equity acknowledges unequal starting places and the need to correct the imbalance." I could just sit and reflect on these quotes all by themselves. This reference is also in section 2 of your reference guide. I'm hoping you've downloaded it. It's linked in the Padlet. On that link that's in your reference guide, it includes a direct link, and the landing page is to a video where this definition comes from. And it's supporting a definition of equity. So if you're at a place where you're looking to redefine that for your team, add on to your organization's existing definition of equity, this video, this resource is a good one for posting on your website. If you have internal data dashboards, you saw the poll that Evan introduced, referenced access to data, right? So wherever your team is focusing, I would probably use that video. It's about a 2-minute video when you go to that link. And it includes, I would probably use it if I were presenting, maybe as an opener, where I'm sharing my organization's priorities on addressing any gaps that exist in the data. There's also a toolkit that's found at that link in section 2 of the resource guide for slide 18. And the toolkit will support you in engaging with your teams on equitable data review. There's lots of templates in that toolkit. I was looking at it this morning, and it supports, those templates support you in articulating gaps, why gaps exist, and articulating the existence of gaps to different audiences. So if you haven't already, please take a look at that resource guide, the reference guide, excuse me. I believe that you will find it very helpful. Let's engage one more time via the chat. And I hope those quotes have inspired some additional thoughts in you. Evan kicked us off, and these quotes likely got us thinking thinking about these definitions. And in the chat box, if you can, please share what you believe to be critical components when building a definition of equity within the context of assessment and data use. So thinking about how we might look outside our traditional mode of data gathering. And as Evan and I were preparing for today's presentation, Evan made that statement to me, looking outside our traditional mode of data gathering. And I wrote it down verbatim, and it really opened my thinking, right? As we're building this culture of data use and thinking about equitable practices and policies in our review of data, what do you believe to be critical components when building a definition of equity? Please feel free to share in the chat. The chat has been opened for you. We'll be looking for your responses. I'll pause for a moment here to give you a chance to offer some reflections. Oh, thank you. We see in the chat multiple sources of data to add layers of context. Yes, the context, layers of context. Equity work does not have a finish line. Acknowledging that as a critical component, I totally agree. Understanding the resources provided to particular students or schools to add context. Yes, context to the scores. It's very necessary. It's an essential component. Totally agree. Evan, anything you would add in terms of essential?
Well, I just love that multiple sources of data. And I think when you and I were chatting about this, you mentioned talking to students and drilling down about chronic absenteeism. And I think looking at this year's data, you have to take it in the context of the last year, really 2 years. But I think for so many LEAs, chronic absenteeism just didn't vanish, right? It's kind of a new normal, is this chronic absenteeism. And why are students still absent? And how is that affecting them? And what can we do to bring them back to engage them? And I think any conversation around the CAASPP results has to also look at attendance data and to talk about, how those are linked, and, and maybe also, school climate data, because that also might be a factor as to why they're coming to school or not coming to school. It's a really, you can't really look at the CAASPP data without some more context.
Yes. Another reflection that's here, gathering data on student groups and also environmental conditions present when testing. I totally agree that context is so essential. Thank you all for engaging with us in the chat. The Padlet remains open. If more thoughts come to your mind, please feel free to share on the Padlet. Yes, thank you, Marky. Let's keep going. So I mentioned that the analogy, or like the metaphor, if you will, that's in my head around this equitable review of our work and equitable review of our practices and policies as we're examining assessment data. The metaphor that I have is, again, the glasses, right? And I don't wear prescription glasses. But I do have some glasses that I wear for style, so don't judge me, okay? And I think about conversations that I have with colleagues who do wear glasses. And, here I come to their office and I'm handing them a report or some paper, some document, and before they read it, they say, oh, wait a minute, let me put on my glasses first. And that act is intentional, right? They know what I'm asking them to do. I'm asking them to look at something. And I hope you see kind of where I'm going with this, because before my colleague even starts to review the document I've handed over, they adjust their perspective. They literally say, wait, let me put my glasses on to make sure that they can see everything clearly before they dive into judgment, before they pose an action item, before they start asking questions. It's an intentional move, an intentional decision that they know they have to start with that step first. And so when you think about an equity mindset, it's important to have this intentionality when approaching data use, that same level of intention, and this specific way of thinking about data review and its explicit focus on centering equity in conversations, why the data is being used, how the data is being used. An equity mindset allows those working with student data to consider the learners as individuals, help challenge any beliefs, and seeks to identify barriers that might be driving the observed student inequities that the data is presented. One term is implicit bias, and it's referenced in a resource that was on our previous slide from the Center for the Study of Social Policy, the glossary that's in your reference guide. The handout, it's on the reference section for slide 17. And implicit bias refers to attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions and decisions in an unconscious manner. An equity mindset requires an active interrogation of those implicit bias. And the list of actions on the slide, they come from the Idea Data Center that is also linked in your reference guide, the reference for slide 18. The interrogation that's called out on the slide makes reference to the fact that everything is not clear in the data. And we saw that in some of your reflections in the chat. There has to be room for, I reflect on the quote that Evan gave me as we were preparing, room for looking outside our traditional mode of data gathering. We have to leave room for that in the conversations, in our work. Let's keep going. To use data to support equity is a cultural foundation. And Evan started us off focusing on the fact that this culture must be modeled, it must be expected and reinforced. This is where the toolkit from the Idea Data Center can support you on calibrating. I mentioned that there's a video on their website, calibrating across common language, across the why, so that this culture is reinforced across your organization, the district, across the school site, and that there's a common commitment to and a shared responsibility for positive, equitable outcomes for all students. This can be done through the use of data to identify and address inequity and the disaggregation of data to understand the experiences of and outcomes for all learners. And remember, none of us in the room are quote unquote experts, right? We're always learning. And I like to think that for as long as there are living, breathing humans within our school sites, we will always be learning, right? There's always going to be something new to learn about the context. And for those of you who did open the glossary that's in the reference guide, prepared by the Center for the Study of Social Policy, you might have noticed that on the page, page 2 of that report, it says that, and I quote, "This is a living document," meaning that the use of data should be used to challenge the beliefs and to learn, not to simply confirm existing beliefs. But the inclusion of, the commitment to authentic engagement of educational partners, that's key. The educational partner engagement is key to this foundation and supports our learning together, our learning as an organization. Okay, engaging educational partners, on the next slide, thank you, is an essential practice to support equity in both policies, practices around assessment and data use. When handled appropriately, these conversations create transparency, and it's also imperative. This transparency is imperative. One way to increase transparency is to prioritize the authentic engagement of educational partners. This is a key component of data analysis and must be present for analysis focused on an equity mindset to occur. Authentic engagement occurs when educational partners are provided with accurate data and they are engaged in meaningful, continuing conversations. Just last week, I attended a conference. It was here in Berkeley. I'm here in Northern California in the Bay Area. And this particular organization hosted their annual equity summit, is what they call it. And educators in the room were talking about non-traditional ways of hearing from educational partners. And I was taking notes as always, right? Because I find that the most idea generating moments come from my colleagues, right? Come from my peers. And one leader in the room mentioned a survey with no more than 3 questions. And that caught my ear. And those 3 questions were all aligned on topic. And so her particular organization took a new strategy with their survey, survey collection. And they sent out 1 email at the beginning of the year that said, for the next 6 weeks, you'll receive links to different surveys. Each survey will be very focused. It will be on a particular topic, no more than 3 questions. And I think they put a time prediction, how long they think the respondents would take to respond. And she shared that they had more responses this past school year than they ever had since she had been with the organization. And she believes that that strategy was effective for them. There was another leader in the room who talked about approaching family members in the pickup line at school sites. And they ensured that each staff person had an iPad and they recorded the family members' responses for them to their survey. So they didn't have to hand them anything, ask them to complete any task. It was verbally answering these questions. Another leader in the room talked about a texting campaign with a code that was posted in every school's front office. It was on their website, and it was one of those 5-digit text responses, like text the word idea to 98848 or whatever their number was, but it was very something quick and catchy that could be remembered by their partners. And so these ideas of authentic engagement allow the partners to communicate what's valuable to them without an interpretation being predetermined for them, if that's clear. Let's keep going. In this process of authentic engagement and reviewing your practices with an equity lens, as you're engaging your partners with data, with assessment data specifically, continuous improvement serves as a foundation for this inquiry and dialogue. And one of the tenets of continuous improvement is to focus on the system and not the people within the system, because it is the system itself that we are questioning. It's the results of the system that we're examining and seek to further understand. So continuous improvement depends on this effective data use. And if you joined us in session 2, you likely heard a discussion of how you can incorporate continuous improvement into the 5 R's data analysis protocol, which is very helpful. So continuous improvement, for those who need a reminder or perhaps may not have heard of it in this frame, it's grounded in the understanding that a system's performance is a result of its design and operation, and it relies on this constant inquiry to support improvement. So the inquiry cycle is continuous, and someone said that in the chat earlier. It doesn't end. Like, we don't get to a point where, okay, finished, but it's this constant reflection, this constant inquiry to understand that context that we were talking about earlier. It's important to consider the outcomes that your LEA or organization is producing, and that goes back to the ways in which we look outside of our traditional data gathering mode, like what other opportunities present themselves as we are going through this cycle of inquiry. And when I think about our work here in Solano County, our support to school districts in our county for specifically around differentiated assistance is an inquiry-based approach. It is exactly this continuous improvement approach. And it, as you heard Evan mention, and he and I were talking about it as we were preparing, our approach includes focus groups with district level staff. We did in one district. We did focus group with principals in another district. We did student focus groups in some of our other districts. And in those examples, we're seeking to understand why the system is producing specific results, what changes can be made to shift those results, and the impact of those changes. And what we did by adding to the data, right? Because we have our assessment data, we have our outcome data, we are adding via these focus groups to that context. We're putting on our equity glasses and engaging with educational partners across these systems to ask them, as the end users, as the major contributors to the system, what changes can be made? And if this change is made, how will that impact you? And I must say that the educational partners in all of my reflection and review of this qualitative data, right, this dialogue data, educational partners have the answer. And so if we haven't encouraged you enough, we want to encourage you. If you haven't already, you might consider partnering with your county office of education as support to you on this continuous improvement approach, because understanding your data equitably with carefully crafted questions, and I mean, like in the example I shared earlier, 2 or 3 questions, right? It doesn't take a litany of questions. We can build on the equity approach that you're developing in your organization to help understand your data, to help explain the data, and to help identify equitable, action-related responses to the data. Thinking about our work as related to compliance, all of us, I believe in this room, have a compliance portion to our work, right? And continuous improvement really shifts from solely focusing on compliance, however, using those moments as the open door, if you will. And I'm shifting from a compliance mindset to a continuous improvement mindset is really foundational to this culture of data use. And you heard Evan mention when the presentation started, the data culture is happening without oversight, right? So it's not someone telling us that, oh, you have to have this approach, you have to have a culture of data. It's something that we develop. And there are many tasks that we all complete for compliance purposes. Like we're not going to stand up here and lie. Yes, it affects all of us. And when we're especially thinking about engaging educational partners, there might be insights that can be surfaced when we're engaging in those compliance-based tasks that we must do. And if the right people are at the table, if the right questions are being asked, remember I referenced those carefully crafted questions, and your colleagues feel supported to engage with the data in meaningful ways beyond completion for compliance, then these conversations can center around equitable outcomes. So I want to encourage you to consider opportunities where you and your teams can leverage the protected time that you have with these compliance-based tasks and get the most out of those moments if you can, right? Think about how that protected time can be infused with data analysis conversations. It can center on actions that support equity for students, right? Use those moments that already exist as your moment to insert this inquiry we've been talking about, this building on this additional context, this constant inquiry that we're referencing. Let's look at the Padlet. And the link has just been dropped in the chat. It'll be dropped in the chat once more. And let's think about how you can use annual activities that we all are subject to, use that protected time, those moments, as opportunities for conversation around further analysis and the discussion of assessment data. We've mentioned some examples here: texting, short and focused surveys, that in-person approach. Evan and I were talking about focus groups. Think about the current existence of annual activities that you have with parent advisory, student advisory, and councils. How can these activities be used to further analyze and discuss assessment data? Navigate to the Padlet. The link is in the chat. And once you've recorded your answer on the Padlet, I want to encourage you to scroll through and see what responses other colleagues have added. And we can continue the conversation. So if something comes to mind, drop to the Padlet, right? What are those activities? Let me pull up the Padlet here. What are those activities that you can leverage, right? They're already on the calendar. They happen every year, same time every year. Those activities where we can infuse more analysis around assessment data, more analysis around inquiry and understanding of the problem that we're investigating, or inquiry around our outcomes and the impact of those outcomes. So I'm going to keep the Padlet open in case you all continue to add reflection. You can hit the plus sign. It's under the section 2 reflection. Hit the plus sign and you can add a new idea, or you can add it in the comment. I do see one idea added: using parent or teacher conferences or back to school night to discuss data, create an action plan for next steps. That is such a great idea. I would probably add a couple of student focus groups to that, but that's just me because I'm here for talking to students. Evan, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and please add if there's other ideas that come to your mind, Evan.
Thanks, Stacey. Yeah, you know what, as you're talking, a number of things, I'm writing stuff down every time we talk, I get ideas, but you know, I do feel like connecting that earlier note about building the capacity of your educational partners, right? It can be really time consuming, right? To build your site council parent and representatives, their understanding of data and the assessment data, and you're doing a needs assessment, and then 2 years later they're gone, right? So you're constantly in this attrition war. But then I think back on some of the work I did in my last district around the ELPAC that was really meaningful, was actually, you know, and building, and I did take a shift in the mindset, right? Because you're like, we have a deadline, it got very compliant oriented, but then to build the understanding around the data, because then once they understood, and I was involved in a subcommittee talking about college and career readiness, which was one of our goals, then they had this ownership that I think gets back to that, like, then that group can take a life of its own in terms of both looking at the existing data, but also asking for more data. They may have insights that they would like, could you give us this more data? We'd like to see this and this great. That it really was very meaningful, the kind of dialogue that came out of that conversation. But it did take a change of the mindset. So, well, thank you, Tacy. I'm going to dive into this section on leadership for effective assessment and data use. And I think, as we've noted already, if you're here, you are a leader. So we'll talk a little bit about the role of leaders in this effective assessment system. So the leader's role in assessment and data use policies and practices really needs to be guided by and directly support a shared vision for teaching and learning. And I really liked what you suggested of taking the equity statement and putting it on my dashboard, right? Because I think that would just be so important as like a little tickler file. Every time you're looking data, like, we're not here to like pat ourselves in the back for those students who are being successful. We're here to close the gaps, right? And I don't think we can kind of start to take it for granted. This was not the case just a few short years ago. I think changes in the dashboard and the LCAP, these things have brought around much more attention around that, but it's easy sometimes still to get caught up in that, like, look how great we are. We're sending this many kids to these great schools or whatever, and yet you still gaps persist. So, but yeah, as a leader, you also want to ensure that your staff is allowed to collaboratively construct community agreements to guide conversations. We'll talk a little bit more about this. They need to also be able to work collaboratively around the decisions around data use, and also be provided with opportunities to expand their knowledge in the area of data literacy. So if you're not doing that, you haven't fulfilled your complete role as a leader. They also, as a leader, you need to place an emphasis on coherence. And I think this was, to an extent, why I like that idea of putting on your dashboard, because it would ensure if equity is at the center of the work you're doing, that you're going to want to reinforce it every time you speak, that it's part of all your communication. And if that's on your dashboard, you can't ignore it when you sit down to look at some data. So you're talking about the area of continuous improvement. If you're articulating that as your priority, it's going to be clear to everyone, even the people who are just stepping into a new role as a parent on the site council will understand that, oh, we're here not just for your child, but for all children, and there are gaps that persist. And we're going to look at our data, even if we have really high performing school, we want to look at, I like the continuous improvement model. You never quit looking at it, right? It's always something to improve upon. So having your LEA, your district or your school site's vision is going to be critical moving forward. So to get into a couple, as I said, my title includes the term data literacy, but let's look at a couple definitions to ground our understanding. So the first definition of data literacy is a process that integrates the analysis of educational data to support decisions intended to improve teaching and learning at the school and classroom levels. Additionally, a second definition would be understanding the properties of data and how you can use them to inform practice. And you do need to have both, right? So as an example, if I'm looking at my smarter balance data that's available in SIRS right now, I'm going to sit down with my team, I'm going to look at this. Well, certainly, supporting data literacy first of all means that we have to have a process in place to analyze this data, right? So we have to have a structure that we're going to look at these assessment data, but everyone who's sitting down to join also has to have a clear understanding of what this data means, right? They need to look at, well, what's an average scale score? What does that mean? What's the standard error band? What does that mean? Why do they differ, right? So there's things you have to prepare everyone for. Understand, we talked about earlier, the claim and target level data, right, in SIRS, right? It's like understanding what those are and how they connect with the standards and what that means for the instructional practice. Those are all key components. So they're both relevant, both these definitions are. And it's really imperative that the staff across all the educational system are operating from the same definitions of data literacy. And as a leader, it's critical that you continue to offer some form of professional development to support this learning. I'd say this also holds true for supporting the understanding of your educational partners. Make it a regular practice at site council meetings or ELAC or DLAC meetings to talk about data, to bring better understanding, to build capacity there. And it's really helpful for teams to have the same understandings, because when they start to engage in conversations, there's a shared understanding of what the data means to begin with. So we're going to take another quick poll here. We're going to use the Mentimeter again. So in addition to supporting staff in their data literacy professional learning, leadership also can help facilitate the creation of community agreements. So community agreements, these are norms. They're important for a part of establishing a collaborative culture of data use. So using the Mentimeter, answer these questions. Does your site currently use community agreements to drive data conversations? And also, if you answered yes, think about how you have used them and when they have helped in the situation, and share it in the chat box. So 2 places going on. Are you using norms? And then in the chat, have they helped in a situation, and share it? So I'm not surprised. I mean, of course, the no, we're not using norms is currently leading the responses here, but it's not always, sometimes we just dive right into the data. I mean, I'm guilty of it. Like, even when I sit down with my team, you can't help yourself. We love to run up the ladder of inference because, we're storytelling, animals. So we want to understand the story, right? Norms help help that along, right? So, and we are going to talk about community agreements on the next couple of slides, but I see one, Angela commented in the chat, yes, we use norms and it helps look at data, show progress and decline. So, and I like what you said too, Tacey, it's not about people, it's about the system, right? And norms can establish that too. Like, it's be hard on issues and easy on people is one that we used to use in my district. We have another comment. Norms helped in our ELPAC educational partners feedback meetings where one norm was to be okay with non-closure. This helped participants understand that the process is continuous. Yeah, it is, if it's your students, your children who are in the system, you want to know what is being done. Like, it's hard to understand why this can't be fixed today. Using norms remove the individual, but to identify plus or minus. So yeah, you can have some, again, it makes it a little less personal. Okay, we'll continue using the chat. Thank you for responding to those questions. Let's dive in and talk a little bit more about community agreements. They're really an important step in establishing that safe environment in which to explore and use data. And I remember in the very beginning, we saw a lot of comments that referred to trust. And it is really critical to establish trust and to have it. And you can read the room sometimes, like, is there trust in this room? Boy, when it's not there, it's really apparent. There may be one person doing all the talking and everybody else is kind of sitting on their hands and looking down. You just see the body language. You're like, interesting, right? Whereas in a community where there's a lot of trust, boy, everybody is welcome to share their thoughts. Everybody is chiming in, and you can very much feel it. So as a leader, you really need to help establish community agreements that support staff's ability to engage in inquiry around student data. So we're using the term community agreements here. You may also be familiar with norms, which we've also used, but norms are not rules, right? So we're going to use community agreements here. Community agreements are effective when a team creates them collaboratively and when their meaning is clear to all. So instead of imposing them, it's better if we can come up with some collaboratively. The exercise of creating these agreements together actually helps strengthen the team. So there's that other value to it, and it improves how they operate. Everybody's part of the process. For agreements to be useful, really, they need to be memorable. And there really shouldn't be more than 5 or 7. You don't want to get bogged down in having too many of these community agreements. I mean, it's especially helpful to phrase them in positive terms, so instead of using terms like don't interrupt, you'll say, listen to understand, right? My boss used to say 3 before me. That was one of our norms. Like I listen for 3 comments before I chime in again. 2 different types of community agreements. There are procedural community agreements as well as behavioral. So a procedural agreement describe some of those technical agreements between team members. For example, agendas are going to be sent out 2 days prior to the meeting for team member review, right? So it's just something we all agree on. That's for consistency, and it also makes the process more smooth, and it shows a little respect. Behavioral agreements, community agreements, describe those interpersonal interactions and how people will conduct themselves. So an example of this agreement could be participants will not talk over one another. Teams can really benefit from regular revisions of these, right? So it's good to revisit them, especially, you have new people on board. So let's revisit them, and do they need to be updated? So really, you can use these community agreements anytime you're not just talking data, but to get consistent in the use of them, they can be applied really at any kind of setting. So specifically to talk about policies and practices, assessment and data use policies really should be guided by the shared vision for teaching and learning that we've talked about throughout. And Tacey referenced the LCAP and the SARC earlier. You may find also that your shared vision is articulated. Maybe you have a strategic plan. Maybe you have a mission statement that appears on your LEA's homepage. Maybe you've got a values statement articulated in your charter for your charter school. These can also be articulated quite clearly within an LCAP, oftentimes where we'll see them also within your SIPSA, the SARC, the principal's message. Again, I like the idea of putting them into a public, anytime you're sharing data, for example, or a newsletter, that you really put your vision and identity right in the front whenever you're talking and communicating with your your staff and your educational partners. And it really does get back to that idea of coherence. If we're always saying the same message, sending the same message, it'll help build the priority and the coherence around, if we're working on equity and the results of CAASPP, for example, it's clear what our intent is when we talk about our results. So let's use the chat again. We have a few more questions we'd like you to weigh in on. And they are, how will data help move this vision forward? So you have a vision for your school that's been articulated, or for your district. How will data then help move the vision forward? And how will you ensure consistency? Drop your thoughts to this in the chat. Casey, I know you and I have talked about this. I thought it was a great example of this. So while people are dropping their thoughts in there, I had a former superintendent. She was awesome, right? And one of the things she shared one time at a conference, this was actually after we were working together, and I heard it and I was like, this is amazing. She had a high poverty district that had a really high percentage. Every school was Title I school-wide. And so they had 90% free and reduced lunch. But even within that context, there were schools that had greater needs. And she was able to use data. And again, she went outside to traditional data. She actually was looking at crime data from the local police to talk about what kind of experience the children attending these schools had in their communities where there was greater crime, even though there's shared there's a shared low income status throughout the district. There were certain parts of this community that were definitely harder hit by crime. And so she used that data to drive this vision forward. And it helped to make other schools understand why we were going to reallocate some resources. It was pretty phenomenal. And I thought that's how, data can be used effectively. Keep us focused on a tight alignment with data and vision. I see also data-driven practices should be at center of leadership goal, ensuring consistency is a matter of record keeping and follow-up, and creating systems that ensure accountability. Yeah, I think if you're going to you're making a big change, and you went back to that transparency when you're talking about educational partners, if you're making a change that promotes equity, I think it's critical that you provide the data that led to the decision, and then the follow-up data to say it's working. It's going to help you in the long run because you're making it very transparent to folks. Here's why we're doing this. Here's what's leading to this change. This is the data we're seeing. It's hard to refute it. And then if your efforts and your initiatives are working, then you show the results and you keep it available. We see also, we strive for student-driven improvement of all student groups, reflect student success. Data also points out where improvement is needed to focus energy, right? So the continuous improvement model. Right, we see where we're successful. We see what the work that still needs to be done. So I think thank you for sharing this information. So really, to support a coherent approach to assessment and data use, as a leader, you need to connect your data practices to your LEA's vision. Regular communication with your staff is really important, and I saw that in the communications, because you want to ensure consistency and also to ensure your messaging is clear and the messaging to everyone. Your staff is going to see that assessment and data use is prioritized. That's really critical. And you want to make sure that it's not just communicated, but you back it up with things like relevant professional development programs and protection of time we talked about earlier. If you can't just say we're data driven and not give time for people to look at their data and actually in a meaningful way. Just making those opportunities for conversations just is priceless. Tacey, I see you came off mute.
Yes, look, I'm ready to jump in. I really resonate with that comment in the chat around being student driven and the improvement of all student groups, their reflections on student success. And I think about, in our county, as I mentioned, we've done a lot of student focus groups, and that includes this concept of student driven, even with students who appear, according to the data, to be the most unengaged group, right? Evan was talking about our work around chronic absenteeism, and our county has really focused on that this year with engaging specifically student focus groups with students who are chronically absent, like not the ones who are coming to school. I mean, we want to talk to them too. However, as aligned with, right, with our priorities, our goals as an organization, those particular student groups are the ones we want to lean into. And so that quote, that comment in the chat really resonated with me about across the student groups, right? So like, how do we think about our continuous improvement work as we go on to the next slide? And that includes students who are not going to fit into these easy categories, right? Like opportunities to think differently about how we're contributing to the context. And so, Evan, I appreciate you sharing the 3 before me for your community norms. I wrote that down. I said, oh, that's a good one. The agenda's 3 days prior is interesting because I think about these simple things that kind of calibrate us on how we're going to approach this data review. And something like that seems very simple, very tangible, something that's easy to be done. And when we're thinking about our balanced assessment system, opportunities like this contribute to our work together under continuous improvement. And let's talk a little bit about what this looks like. So let's go to the next slide, and then we'll go ahead to the next one and talk about our assessment landscape. To lead a balanced assessment system, we must have a full understanding of the current landscape, and that's the landscape at our school sites and at the system as a whole, the system level as a whole, okay? And to gain this perspective, an assessment audit might be very beneficial for us to undertake, keep that in mind. An assessment audit can provide with insights, and there are, especially when there are different assessments that students are taking, different resources that teachers are using to support their understanding, the purposes of the assessments, and the extent in which students and teachers are engaging with the assessment, and the amount of evidence that's taken from each set of results. In your resources, there's a handout 3.1 is what it's called, and it's linked in the Padlet, and it's titled Assessment Inventory. And I mentioned to you before that I like to download the handouts, so I have my copy in front of me, but this assessment inventory is amazing. And it is included in our materials on the Padlet, and it's a resource that you can use at your site and tailor the document to fit your needs so that it can support you in gathering all of the assessments that exist currently on the table across your system. And I've shared a version with principals in my work here in the county. And I say a version because, like I mentioned, I like to download the resources. I will brand them with our logo. I like to add instructions for participants on what to do, link the instructions throughout the document. And I encourage you to do the same and make it your own. This audit is really essential. And we have one of our districts that did a form of an audit. It wasn't with this particular document, but with another. And it did take a year. So it's not something you can just do tomorrow, but you can start the conversation tomorrow. And in order to identify opportunities that exist to engage your partners in different ways of approaching the data, it'll be important to identify opportunities across your system's assessment usage that might include redundancy, or it'll help you confirm the relevancy of the assessments that are currently in use, and also help you make connections of the assessments to your organization's goals overall. The assessment audit can help you do that. And all of us, as we've talked about, we are all the data people, right, in our organization. And I feel pretty confident that this assessment audit will help you either move the conversation forward or offer an opinion. And the audit can serve as your baseline data, right? And as Evan said, we like to use data as a starting point. And so think of the audit as your starting point, right? Especially when you're trying to achieve a particular goal or a way of approaching your practice for looking at assessment data in an equitable way. Let's keep going. So another valued exercise in our continuous improvement process after your assessment audit is complete is to really dive into the assessments and explore their alignment to the standards that are being taught to students. And you can modify the assessment audit. It's a template, it's a Word document, so you can modify it to include areas for this. You can indicate how much time is being used in the classroom for particular assessments, the content area that is derived from not only the assessment, but to align with the appropriate standards or the grade level outcome. California educators have resources that support standards alignment materials, and they come from our Smarter Balance interim assessments for English language arts or ELA, and mathematics, and the new California science test interim assessments, which will be available this fall. And if you're like myself and colleagues in our office, we are particularly excited about the interim assessments for the California science test. These assessments can be delivered as interim benchmarks, interim assessment blocks, which focus on smaller clusters of standards that can be administered in non-standardized ways to support formative instruction. Student assessment data from the summative assessments can then be backwards mapped to the interim assessments to help improve student knowledge. And there is a training website that's linked on the Padlet regarding upcoming training opportunities for all of the interims, including the new interims that will be released this fall. And for those who think of the assessment inventory to support those of you kind of in both categories, whether you are from a larger system or it could be a small system and you have a lot of assessment options on the table and you want to organize them to understand the use cases for each. And you'll notice on the assessment inventory, there are sections where the audit can be done by school, by grade level, but also can be done by content area. So it could be something that you could charge other leaders across your system with completing for the particular area that they oversee. And then you will have all of this data organizational wide so that you could really refine it. So that's one area. Another opportunity is if you're in a system that is looking for ensuring that your assessment options are robust, right? So this means you could use the audit to identify what are we missing. Maybe there's an opportunity to insert the interim assessments related to Smarter Balance or the science test, right? Maybe there's a gap that needs to be filled that can be filled by those. So either way, whichever position you're coming from, the audit can support you with next steps. Additionally, there's an additional resource. It's the Smarter Content Explorer, and it's available to support the continuous investigation of standards for ELA and mathematics, especially during or after the assessment audit, if you want to connect it to the standards that are being measured on each test. The tool supports instruction by helping teachers understand claims, targets, and standards assessed by all of the Smarter Balance assessments. And you heard Evan mention those claims and target level reports. Content in the Smarter Content Explorer can be filtered by grade level and content area to view all available summative and interim assessments. You then select an assessment and explore its content in more depth. In your resource guide, there's a link to the Smarter Content Explorer in case you haven't seen it. I encourage you to familiarize yourself with it, as you might find it to be very helpful, especially if you're going to engage in the assessment audit. So let's go back to the chat. and think through some strategies that you might have to monitor alignment among curriculum, instruction, and assessment to the grade level standards. We've mentioned several here. We have the assessment inventory, the assessment audit, and the template that's in your resources as one. We have the Smarter Content Explorer as another. What are some other strategies that you're considering, that you've thought about, that you're wondering about to support alignment of curriculum, instruction, and assessment to the standards? Is there anything else that comes to your mind? The question has been dropped in the chat for you as a recap, but the chat's open. Feel free to drop some reflections in the chat related to other resources that help us monitor this work. Mastery Connect to track and improve. Okay, that sounds like a good resource. I have to look into that now. Have you heard of Mastery Connect, Evan? I haven't heard of that before.
I have not.
Yeah, I gotta look into that. That's why I love these sessions, because I always learn a new idea. Oh, ELPAC, the Smarter Tools for Teachers. I love Tools for Teachers.
Yes, oh my God.
I know, we haven't talked about that enough. Tools for Teachers is a really good resource. Oh, scope and sequence. Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's a good strategy. Thank you all for sharing this. Thank you, Chelsea. I'm going to turn it back over to you. I'm really getting excited about some of these ideas in the chat.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tacey and Evan. Really engaging. I think we all learned a lot. Sounds like Tacey learned a lot too. It's always really great conversation. And thank you all our participants here for engaging with us. Before you head out, we have one more request to ask of you. If you have a moment before you leave and sign off for today, please complete this exit survey. The link has been placed into the chat, or you can just use your smartphone, the camera on it, to grab this QR code and complete our exit survey. We really rely on the results of these surveys to inform future training opportunities, to make sure the content that we're providing is useful and relevant. And the link to the survey will also be sent to you in a thank you email shortly following our session here today. So if you are able, please take a moment to complete the survey. And I see that we are at time. So whenever you need to go, please feel free to exit. And thank you so much for your time and participation here today. Thanks, everyone. And thank you so much to our presenters as well. Thank you.